Wealth. It's something most of us desire, whether we admit it or not. It promises security, comfort, freedom. It can shape the direction of a life, influence the choices we make, and quietly determine what we prioritize above everything else. But how far would you go to achieve it? Would you sacrifice your time, your relationships, your principles? Would you spend your life chasing it? Would you serve it? If wealth was promised, would you bow to a demon? If you too are something most of us desire, check out Pantheon, our brand inspired by myths, legends and folklore. We ship worldwide and are rated excellent on Trustpilot. Link in the description. You cannot serve God and Mammon. Jesus said that in the Gospel of Matthew during a section of teaching concerned with loyalty, devotion, and the things that quietly shape human priorities. A short sentence, yet one word within it has carried centuries of interpretation and debate. Mammon. The term comes from the Aramaic word Mammon, a common expression used throughout the ancient Near East to describe wealth, property, or material riches. Similar forms appear in Hebrew and Syriac writings as well, where the word consistently refers to possessions or accumulation of resources. Its earliest usage carried no supernatural meaning. Mammon was wealth, money, land, livestock, trade, goods, any form of property that could be gathered and preserved. These things represented far more than luxury. Wealth determined survival. Land ensured food production. Stored grain could mean the difference between endurance and famine. Livestock and precious metals provided stability in societies where political power and economic conditions could shift quickly. Wealth naturally held enormous importance in daily life. Yet the warning recorded in Matthew suggests that wealth possesses a deeper and more complicated influence over human behavior. You cannot serve God and Mammon. Wealth is now described as something that can be served. Service implied loyalty and obedience. A servant belongs to a master. To serve something means orienting your life around it, giving it attention, devotion, priority. But here, wealth can become more than a resource. It can become a master. This idea transforms the meaning of the word mammon. What begins as a simple term for riches now carries a warning about power and wealth, and it can hold over human priorities. Over time, that warning would grow far beyond the sentence in which it first appeared. Early Christian writers returned to the passage repeatedly, treating it as a serious warning about the strange power wealth seemed to hold over human behavior. For these writers, the problem was never wealth itself. Food, land, and property were necessary for survival. In the ancient world, often meant stability in a fragile and unpredictable environment. Crops could fail, cities could fall to war, and political authorities could shift without warning. Possessions provided security. Yet early Christian thinkers noticed something troubling about wealth. It rarely remained neutral. Wealth had a tendency to reshape priorities. What began as a tool for survival could slowly become the center of a person's ambitions. The pursuit of security could grow into the pursuit of accumulation. Over time, the desire for stability could transform into the desire for more. It's a pattern that appears repeatedly. Writers such as Augustine of Hippo warned that wealth possessed a unique ability to capture the human heart. Material riches could create the illusion of independence, convincing people that security came from possessions rather than spiritual devotion. The problem, therefore, wasn't necessarily the money itself, but the way wealth gradually redirected loyalty. We naturally organize our lives around what we value most. Attention follows desire, and over time the things we pursue shape our identity and priorities. It was believed that wealth could easily take that position. In that moment, the warning about Mammon becomes clearer. It describes the moment wealth becomes the highest loyalty. When that transformation does happen, devotion itself begins to shift. Decisions become guided by profit and loss. Moral choices become entangled with the pursuit of gain. Gradually, the pursuit of riches begins occupying the same psychological space that religious devotion once held. You cannot serve God and Mammon. The sentence represents two masters because wealth had the power to demand the same loyalty that faith demanded. Mammon came to represent something deeper than greed. It represented the subtle moments when wealth stops being possessed and becomes the possessor. Now, what kind of entity possesses? What does religion have a habit of doing to forces it doesn't like? It personifies, gives a form, a shape, demonizes. By the medieval period, Christian thinkers were increasingly concerned with the nature of temptation. Temptation was often understood as something active, something that exerted pressure on the human soul. Greed held a particularly troubling place in this discussion. Unlike violence or anger, greed could appear respectable. It could hide behind responsibility, ambition, or the desire to provide for a family. You could pursue wealth for years without ever recognizing that the chase had become the center of your life. Medieval sermons frequently returned to this theme. Rather than condemn outright, the desire for it was treated with suspicion. The more you accumulated, the easier it began to believe that the security came from possessions rather than faith. This gradually transformed the meaning of Mammon. At first, the word had simply described wealth, but in theological writing, Mammon increasingly referred to the temptation behind wealth. It became the name for the influence that encouraged the endless desire for more. Over time, that influence began to look less like an abstract idea and more like a presence. Yeah, a demonic presence. Let's talk about hell. Fire, brimstone, suffering. The first place you probably imagine when you hear the word demon. By the medieval period, hell had become something far more elaborate. It had begun to look like a kingdom. If kingdoms had kings, princes, and nobles, then hell must have its own hierarchy as well. Demons were rulers with territories, each one associated with a particular form of human corruption, and within that infernal order, greed had its own prince. The idea begins to take clearer shape alongside the medieval fascination with what became known as the 7 deadly sins. The roots of this idea go back centuries earlier. In the 4th century, a desert monk named Evagrius Ponticus wrote about what he called the 8 evil thoughts, the recurring temptations he believed disturbed the human mind. Among them were pride, anger, lust, and the love of money. 200 years later, Pope Gregory reshaped this list into the 7 sins that would become famous to this day. Pride, lust, envy, wrath, gluttony, sloth, and greed. These sins were believed to represent the deepest moral weaknesses in human nature. Each one described a way a human life could slowly fall out of balance. Pride elevated the self above everything else. Lust reduced people to objects of desire. Wrath replaced judgment with rage. But greed held a particularly uncomfortable place among them. Greed could disguise itself. A quiet corruption that made greed especially dangerous. So when later writers began pairing demons with 7 deadly sins, Mammon became associated with avarice, the endless hunger for wealth. One of the clearest examples appears in the late 16th century, when the German theologian Peter Binsfeld formally linked Mammon to the sin of greed in his classification of demons. He becomes the ruler of the desire for wealth, the prince of treasure, gold, and material obsession, the spirit behind the endless belief that more will finally be enough. Yet Mammon remains an unusual figure in demonology. When we hear about demons, we may think of the 72 spirits listed in our favourite book, the Ars Goetia. But Mammon isn't among them. He doesn't have a sigil, nor a ritual for calling him forth, which reveals something important about the nature of this particular demon. He was never meant to be summoned. He's already here, corrupting. In the 7th century, English poet John Milton published one of the most influential works of Christian literature ever written. Paradise Lost retells the biblical story of Satan's rebellion and the fall of humanity. But Milton does something interesting. He gives the demons personalities, motivations, and distinct roles. Milton's description of Mammon is revealing because his obsession with wealth begins long before the fall. According to Milton, Mammon has already turned his gaze downward while still in heaven, studying the riches beneath the ground. While other angels admired the glory of God and the perfection of heaven, Mammon admired its material splendor. His fascination was with gold, suggesting that the corruption associated with greed existed even before the rebellion. Mammon didn't fall because he suddenly discovered wealth in hell. His priorities were already different, and after the fall, that fascination continues. In hell, Mammon becomes one of the voices arguing against attempting another war with heaven. Instead, he proposes something else. If heaven can't be reclaimed, then the fallen angels should build power where they now stand. Under his influence, the demons begin mining the ground of hell, extracting gold and precious metals. The riches they uncover become the foundation for Pandemonium, the vast capital of hell where the demons gather to rule their new domain. The symbol is difficult to miss. Even in hell, Mammon's instinct is the same. He looks at a ruined world and begins searching for treasure. Gold becomes the material that builds the seat of demonic power. Milton's portrayal deepens the idea that had been forming around Mammon for centuries. He is the mindset that sees value in riches above everything else. The angel who looked at heaven and noticed the gold beneath the floor. So, what does it all mean then? Let's go back to the statement. You cannot serve God and Mammon. You can't serve both. Divided loyalty is impossible. You must pick a side. That's the real force of the warning. When Jesus places God and Mammon side by side, he's doing something deliberate. He's presenting wealth as a rival power. Mammon is being described as a master, a rival to God. This isn't about greed in the simple sense, but what sits at the center of a life, what directs our choices, what determines our sacrifices, what gives us security, what we trust when everything else feels uncertain. That is where wealth becomes dangerous. Money is never just money. Wealth carries promises, safety, control, stability, freedom from fear. We know all that. It's why we crave it. It's deeply seductive. Something we can hold, count, protect, and build our lives around. It's exactly why Mammon becomes more than a word for riches. Once wealth begins to offer the kind of security, meaning, and direction that faith is supposed to provide, it can replace devotion. That is why Jesus says you must choose God or Mammon, one or the other. They both ask for trust. They both ask for loyalty. They both ask us to organize our lives around them. And the heart can't do that twice. The demon is here, right now. He lingers every time we move the goalposts a little further, every time we convince ourselves that this much will finally be enough, only to realize that enough is a line that retreats the moment we reach for it. We think we're the ones in control. We think we're simply building our futures. But look at the altar we've built, together. The hours we don't get back. The family dinners missed for a screen. The sleep lost to the anxiety of a spreadsheet. The moments of wonder traded for the pursuit of yield. We aren't just working for a living. We're paying a collective tax to a master that will never be satisfied. Mammon doesn't need a temple, and he doesn't need a ritual. He only needs our goals, our ambitions. He only needs us to believe that our lives are worth exactly what our net worth says they are. So stop looking for horns, or tails, or ancient carvings in the dirt. Look at what we've sacrificed today. Look at what we're terrified to lose tomorrow. Look at what sits on the throne of our internal world. We cannot serve God and Mammon, but we have already picked a side. The question is, are we brave enough to admit which one it is?